Picture this: southern Spain, the year 1212. Two worlds collide in a single violent heartbeat. A wave of heavy Christian cavalry thunders forward, armored horses, steel, and faith crashing into the Almohad center like a falling fortress. You expect the line to shatter. You expect bodies to scatter. But it doesn't break. It doesn't even bend. Instead, the horses rear up screaming, legs kicking, tangling in something that should not be there. Something solid. Something alive. Look down. Those aren't wooden stakes. They're men. The Amulin, 10,000 elite African guards, locked knee to knee, bound together with heavy iron chains, anchored into the earth, a living wall, a breathing, bleeding barricade. Music. They stab upward into the soft bellies of the horses. They hook riders with blades and drag them into the dirt to be butchered. And just 50 yards behind this slaughter, in the eye of the storm sits one man, the Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir. He isn't fighting. He isn't barking orders. He's seated on his shield, calmly reading the Quran, barely glancing up as arrows thud into the ground around him. It's the ultimate display of holy arrogance. This is the Battle of Las Navas, the single most desperate day in the history of the Spanish Reconquista, where the fate of Western Europe came down to a suicide charge against a wall of chained fanatics. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you like uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting like and subscribing for more. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It still blows my mind that we're exploring these ancient stories together from all over the world, connected across time by pure curiosity. Now, to understand how we end up at this slaughterhouse in the mountains, we have to strip away the romantic myth of medieval chivalry. This was not a polite war for land. It was a war of extermination. By the summer of 1211, the Christian kingdoms of Spain weren't winning. They were being hunted. Because a new superpower had surged out of North Africa, the Almohads. These weren't the poets and philosophers of old Córdoba. These were fundamentalist warriors, men who looked at the squabbling Christian kings of the north and saw an infestation to be cleansed. Their advance was a blitzkrieg. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and rolled north like a tidal wave. And they didn't just take territory, they erased it. The great fortress of Salvatierra, headquarters of the Order of Calatrava, fell. The monks were slaughtered. Their heads were piled high as a warning. The road to Toledo lay wide open. King Alonso of Castile watched that green tide approach with absolute terror. He was a man haunted by ghosts. 20 years earlier, at the Battle of Alarcos, he had faced the Almohads and lost everything. His army was annihilated. He barely escaped with his life, fleeing in disgrace while his men were executed behind him. Now, as an older man, he could feel the nightmare returning. But this time the scale was different. The intelligence reports were impossible to ignore. The Caliph, known to the Spanish as the Miramamolin, had declared a supreme jihad. He was mobilizing the full weight of the African empire. The numbers were staggering. Chronicles speak of hundreds of thousands, an army so vast it drank rivers dry. And his ambition went beyond Spain. He boasted he would turn St. Peter's Basilica in Rome into a stable for his horses. This wasn't just a threat to Castile. This was an existential threat to Christendom itself. When word of the gathering storm reached Rome, Pope Innocent III realized normal politics wouldn't survive it. So he escalated. He declared a crusade, and overnight, everything changed. The war in Spain was no longer some regional border struggle. It was now on par with the fight for Jerusalem. The Pope offered a plenary indulgence to anyone who marched to Toledo, a brutally simple transaction. Fight for Alonso, and your soul is wiped clean. The response was chaotic. Knights from France, mercenaries from Lombardy, adventurers from across the Holy Roman Empire. They grabbed swords, kissed relics, and headed south. They were the ultramontanos, men from beyond the mountains. They were hungry for salvation and loot. But they were walking into a cultural minefield, because these foreign crusaders expected a clear, clean, holy war. They expected to kill every Muslim they saw. They weren't prepared for the messy reality of Spain, where Christians and Muslims had lived, traded, and even allied with each other for centuries. By spring of 1212, Toledo became a powder keg. Tens of thousands of foreign crusaders crammed into the streets, rubbing shoulders with local Spanish militias. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And then the French knights discovered something that horrified them. Muslims living peacefully inside the city walls, protected subjects. To the fanatics, this wasn't politics. This was heresy. Why march 1,000 miles to fight infidels if you're going to tolerate them at home? Riots erupted. The Allies began killing the very people they claimed to be protecting. King Alonso suddenly found himself trapped in a nightmare scenario. An enemy army of biblical proportions marching up from the south, and a friendly army of violent zealots tearing his capital apart from the inside. He had to move. He had to get them out. He had to march into the mountains to meet the beast. But he wasn't just marching against the Almohads. He was marching against the land itself. The Sierra Morena Mountains were a natural fortress, a wall of rock blocking the road south, and the Caliph knew he was coming. The Almohads had seized the high ground. They had blocked the passes. They were waiting. Alonso was leading 12,000 knights and tens of thousands of infantry straight toward a trap. He knew it. The other kings knew it. But the alternative was to sit in Toledo and wait to be besieged until the walls fell. So they marched toward the narrow passes, toward the heat, toward the chains, and the crusade began, not with a battle against the Almohads, but with a massacre. As the coalition army moved south from Toledo, they reached the fortress of Malagon. The garrison surrendered, expecting the standard rules of war: imprisonment, ransom, maybe a negotiated release. The Ultramontanos didn't care. To them, surrender was just a delay in God's work. They drew swords and butchered the garrison to the last man. King Alonso was horrified, not necessarily out of mercy, but out of strategy. If you slaughter everyone who surrenders, nobody will ever surrender again. Every castle becomes a fight to the death. But when Alonso tried to rein in his foreign allies, the fragile coalition cracked. The French Crusaders were already miserable. They weren't built for the brutal Spanish summer. The heat boiled them alive inside their mail. They were hungry, thirsty, and now they felt cheated, denied their holy right to plunder freely. So just days before the main event, the unthinkable happened. The French Crusaders packed up and went home, almost all of them. Tens of thousands of knights and infantry gone. The bulk of the heavy shock troops simply turned around and marched north. A catastrophic betrayal. In an instant, Alonso's grand army was cut in half. The crusade was, for all practical purposes, over. Now it was just a desperate Spanish civil defense force standing against an empire, and the camp should have been suicidal. But strangely, the betrayal clarified everything. It stripped away the illusion. What remained were the locals, the men with skin in the game. and leading them were three kings who, under normal circumstances, would have happily killed each other. First, Alonso of Castile, the architect of the alliance, walking a tightrope of anxiety. He knew his legacy would be decided in a single day. Lose here, and Castile could vanish from the map. Second, Peter of Aragon, young, flamboyant, reckless, the rock star of the trio. He arrived in Toledo not with quiet prayer, but with a lavish parade, practically daring the world to doubt him. And finally, Sancho of Navarre, Sancho the Strong. And that nickname wasn't metaphor. Forensic analysis of his remains suggests he stood nearly 7 feet tall, a literal giant in an age where the average man was around 5 feet 5. Sancho hadn't even wanted to be here. He hated Alonso. Castile had stolen land from Navarre years earlier, and Sancho had flirted with the Almohads out of spite. He was the wild card. But the Pope had twisted his arm, and maybe, just maybe, the giant realized that if Castile fell, Navarre would be next. So he marched south, bringing heavy cavalry and a personal grudge. These three rivals stood shoulder to shoulder as the diminished army reached the foothills of the Sierra Morena. Their plan was simple: force the Despeñaperros Pass, the main artery from the central plateau into the south, and meet the Almohad army on the other side. But the Caliph wasn't stupid. He had scouts everywhere. As the Christians approached the narrow gorge of the pass, their hearts sank. It wasn't just blocked, it was fortified. The Almohad advance guard held the cliffs overlooking the trail. The path was so narrow men would have to march single file. Above them, thousands of archers and rock throwers waited. If the Christians pushed through, it would be Thermopylae, but this time, the Spartans would be the ones slaughtered. The Christian army was trapped. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't stay where they were. The rocky ground had little water, and supplies were vanishing fast. And retreat? Retreat meant limping back to Toledo in humiliation, handing the Caliph victory without him even drawing a sword. For 2 days, the army baked in the sun. Arguments erupted in the royal tents. Some nobles begged for retreat. Others suggested a suicidal charge up the cliffs. The tension was suffocating. The crusade had hit a dead end, literally against a wall of stone. And it's here, in this moment of absolute hopelessness, that history takes a turn toward the mythical. A figure emerged from the scrubland. Not a knight, not a noble. A weather-beaten local shepherd, scruffy, sunburned, and stubborn. His name, according to legend, was Martin al-Hajgara. He approached the guards and demanded to see the king. He said he knew something. He said the Almohad scouts had missed something. He spoke of a path, a cow path, a narrow, forgotten trail that twisted through jagged peaks and bypassed the guarded pass entirely. He pointed toward a terrifying ridge and said, "Up there, if you can climb that, you'll come out behind them." It sounded insane. It sounded like a trap. Why would a shepherd know a route an army of scouts missed? Was he an Almohad spy leading them into an ambush? Alonso looked to the giant Sancho, then to the reckless Peter. They had no water, no time, no choice. They chose to trust the shepherd. And under the cover of darkness, the Christian host began to move like ghosts into the mountains. They moved like shadows. Under cover of darkness, the Christian army began threading itself into the mountains, following the shepherd's path. Calling it a road would have been generous. It was a scar in the earth, a goat trail clinging to cliffs where one misstep meant death. This wasn't terrain meant for armies. The knights had to dismount, dragging terrified horses by the reins. Infantry scrambled over rocks, passing shields and spears hand to hand. Orders were whispered. No talking, no trumpets, no prayers spoken aloud. If an Almohad scout heard the clank of steel echo through the ravines, the entire army would be caught stretched into a single-file killing zone. It was a gamble born of desperation. For hours they climbed, lungs burning, legs shaking, expecting an ambush at every bend. But none came. The shepherd had told the truth. As dawn broke on Friday, July 13th, the vanguard crested the final ridge. One by one, exhausted men spilled onto a wide, flat plateau known as the Mesa del Rey, the Table of the King. They had done it. They'd bypassed the blockade. They were behind the Almohad choke point. But any celebration died instantly. Because when they looked down into the valley of Las Navas, their blood ran cold. For weeks they'd heard rumors about the size of the Almohad army. Seeing it was something else entirely. The valley wasn't just occupied, it was carpeted. As far as the eye could see stretched a sea of white tents, arranged with geometric precision, less like a military camp and more like a city made of canvas. Smoke from thousands of fires hung in the air, blurring the horizon. And at the center of it all stood a pavilion of bright red velvet, surrounded by green banners, the quarters of the Caliph. Down below, the sudden appearance of the Christian army on the plateau caused shock, but not panic. When Muhammad al-Nasir emerged from his red tent and looked up at the Mesa del Rey, he didn't see danger. He saw opportunity. Yes, the Christians had bypassed the pass, but now they were trapped on a flat plateau with their backs to a precipice. They were exhausted, thirsty, cut off from supplies. The Caliph had fresh water, endless food, and an army that outnumbered them at least 2-1. Some sources say 4-1. He reportedly turned to his advisors and remarked that Allah had delivered his enemies directly to his slaughtering block. He didn't even order an immediate attack. He waited. He would let the sun and thirst finish them. For the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, a surreal standoff unfolded. The armies stared at each other across the valley. The Christians refused to come down. The Almohads refused to go up. Inside the Christian camp, the situation was desperate. The last rations were eaten. Horses gnawed on leather straps. Men chewed belts to trick their stomachs. King Alonso knew the truth. They couldn't wait. They couldn't retreat. They had to attack. On the night of Sunday, July 15th, the order passed quietly through the ranks. Confess your sins. Make peace with God. Tomorrow, we die. Mass was held under the open sky. There was no wailing, just grim resolve. Sancho of Navarre checked his heavy mace. Peter of Aragon donned his finest armor. And Alonso, the man who had lived in fear of this moment for 20 years, finally stopped trembling. There was nowhere left to run. As the sun set, the soldiers looked down at thousands of Almohad campfires flickering in the valley. It looked like a fallen galaxy, stars scattered across the earth. Monday, July 16th, 12:12. Dawn. The silence shattered with the sound of metal on metal. 12,000 Christian soldiers tightened girths, checked mail, lowered visors. Alonso arranged his army into a classic Crusader formation, a trident of 3 blocks. On the left wing rode Peter II of Aragon, his Catalan knights flamboyant, shields blazing red and yellow. On the right wing sat the giant Sancho of Navarre, commanding heavy cavalry and deadly crossbowmen. And in the center, holding the largest force, was Alonso himself, leading the military orders. The Templars, the Hospitallers, the Order of Santiago, professional monk warriors, the tip of the spear. Across the valley, the Almohad formation was terrifying not for its discipline, but for its depth. The Caliph arranged his army in concentric layers meant to absorb and suffocate. At the front stood thousands of volunteer jihadists, lightly armed fanatics whose job wasn't to win, but to die slowly. Behind them waited disciplined Berber infantry with long spears and camel-hide shields. Behind them, the heavy cavalry. And at the very back, on a fortified rise, sat the Caliph within his ring of chained guards. The strategy was brutal and brilliant. Let the Christian knights smash themselves apart on wave after wave. Let the heat cook them alive, then swarm them. By mid-morning, the signal was given. The ground began to shake. The Christian vanguard surged forward, led by Diego López de Haro. This wasn't a trot. It was a thunderbolt. Thousands of armored horses accelerated into a full gallop, lances lowering in unison. The impact sounded like a train derailing. The knights smashed into the Almohad front line with apocalyptic force. The volunteers didn't break. They evaporated. Shields splintered. Bodies vanished under hooves. To an outside observer, it looked like total victory. The Crusaders roared. They thought the battle was over. They were wrong. This was exactly what the Caliph wanted. As the knights pushed deeper, momentum bled away. A cavalry charge is a one-use weapon. Once it stops, you're just a man on a horse surrounded by enemies, and the Almohad formation was too deep. The knights smashed through the first layer, only to slam into the wall of Berber regulars. Suddenly, the charge became a grinding melee. The Berbers held firm, thrusting spears into horses' bellies. Knights were dragged down and beaten to death in the dust. The Crusader lines began to fragment. Light Almohad cavalry swept the flanks, hurling arrows and javelins. They were faster, cooler, used to the heat. The Christian knights, entombed in steel under the July sun, began to boil alive. Dehydration hit within minutes. Diego López de Haro found himself surrounded with his son. They fought back to back, blades dull, arms numb. For every enemy they killed, 2 more appeared. From the hill, King Alonso watched his vanguard disappear. The trap was closing. The green tide wrapped around the flanks. The banner of the cross wavered. The banner of the crescent advanced. Alarcos was happening all over again. Alonso turned to the Archbishop of Toledo riding beside him and said words that echoed through history. "Archbishop, here we die." Rodrigo Jiménez de Rada looked at the collapsing lines, at the king teetering on despair, and realized this wasn't just a battle. This was civilization on the brink. If the center broke now, Toledo would fall by nightfall. History pivoted on a breath. The archbishop grabbed the king's bridle and shouted back, "No, sire, here we shall live and conquer." Something snapped. The fear that had haunted Alonso for 20 years vanished, replaced by cold fury. Against every rule of medieval warfare, he drew his sword and charged, alone. Seeing the king ride straight into death, the royal standard-bearer spurred forward, raising Castile's banner high. The effect was electric. The exhausted knights saw the banner advancing, not retreating. They saw their king fighting. The reserves didn't wait for orders. They roared and followed. On the left, Peter of Aragon saw the center surge and unleashed his knights, plunging into the fight with reckless fury. On the right, Sancho of Navarre saw the Almohad wings overextended. He knew the moment had come. He signaled the charge. Navarre's heavy cavalry smashed into the flank like a battering ram. Now the Almohads weren't facing a broken army. They were facing 3 kingdoms moving as one. The combined charge was unstoppable. Infantry buckled, lines collapsed, and through the dust, the red tent came into view. At the summit, waiting, the Caliph stood, and for the first time that day, he felt fear. The red tent stood on the hill like a wound in the landscape. As the Christian lines surged forward, the Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir rose from his seat and looked down at the battlefield he believed was already won. The arrogance was gone. The boredom was gone. His army, carefully layered, numerically superior, was collapsing in front of him. What remained was his final line of defense. The Imulan, 10,000 elite guards chained together, knee to knee, anchored into the earth. The wall. Alonso and his knights charged uphill, horses foaming, armor slick with blood, straight toward that living barricade. The momentum was enormous, but physics is merciless. You cannot drive a horse into a solid wall of men who cannot move. The charge slammed to a violent halt. Horses reared and screamed, legs tangled in iron chains. The guards stabbed upward with scimitars and spears, killing mounts and riders alike. The summit became a choking, grinding scrum of men, metal, and panic. The Christians were close enough to see the whites of the Caliph's eyes, but they couldn't reach him. The chains held. The charge stalled at the finish line. If the wall didn't break in minutes, the sheer mass of the Almohad army would engulf them from behind. They needed a miracle. Or perhaps they needed a giant. Sancho VII of Navarre saw it immediately. Hacking at the men was useless. This wasn't about killing soldiers. It was about breaking the machine. He didn't aim for the guards. He aimed for the anchors. Spurring forward with his Navarrese knights, the towering king fixed his eyes on the iron stakes driven deep into the ground. Legend says his roar cut through the chaos of battle. Some accounts claim he leapt his horse over the first line of chains. Others say his massive mace, heavy as an anvil, smashed the links apart with a single blow. However it happened, the result was the same. Snap. The moment the chain broke, the wall lost its power. The guards, suddenly untethered, collapsed into confusion. The Navarrese cavalry poured through the gap like water through a shattered dam. Inside the red tent, everything fell apart. The chanting stopped, replaced by screams. The pavilion ropes were cut. The red velvet canopy collapsed. The symbol of Almohad invincibility hit the ground. Muhammad al-Nasir didn't draw his sword. He didn't die a martyr. He panicked. In a moment that would destroy his reputation forever, the Caliph scrambled out the back of his tent. He didn't even saddle a war horse. He leapt onto a mule and fled, leaving behind his Quran, his treasure, and his army. When the Almohad soldiers saw the red tent fall and their Caliph run, the psychological collapse was total. This wasn't a retreat. It was a rout. An army dissolved into a mob. The Battle of Las Navas was over. The killing was not. For nearly 20 miles, Christian cavalry hunted the fleeing Almohads. No mercy was given. Years of fear and humiliation exploded into a frenzy of violence. By nightfall, the scale of death was unimaginable. Arab chroniclers called it a catastrophe without parallel. Christian sources claimed 100,000 dead. Even allowing for medieval exaggeration, archaeology confirms the slaughter was immense. The land earned a new name: the Valley of the Dead. Sancho of Navarre took a souvenir: heavy iron chains from the Caliph's tent. He carried them home. If you look at the coat of arms of Navarre, or even the flag of Spain, you'll still see them today. Gold chains on red, with an emerald at the center, symbolizing the Caliph's fallen authority. As the adrenaline faded, Exhaustion and greed took over. The Almohad camp was a mobile imperial court, overflowing with gold, silk, food, and horses. Soldiers ripped through tents, filling helmets with dinars, seizing Arabian steeds, devouring stores of honey, dates, and grain that saved them from starvation. But one trophy stood above the rest. Not gold, not jewels. A massive silk banner woven with Quranic verses, the Pendón de las Navas, the Caliph's personal standard. Alonso sent it to the monastery of Las Huelgas in Burgos, where it still hangs today, one of the most important surviving works of Islamic textile art in the world. Yet the victory was soaked in horror. By morning, the smell was unbearable. Bodies lay piled so high in ravines that they reshaped the land itself. Alonso wrote to Pope Innocent III that his army lacked firewood, but it didn't matter. Broken spears and arrows littered the field in such numbers they fueled campfires for days. The air became poisonous. The army had to move just to breathe. Before leaving, the three kings and the archbishop gathered the survivors for a Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving. Men crusted in blood stood atop a carpet of corpses and sang, "We praise thee, O God." It was the psychological pivot of the Reconquista. For centuries, Christian Spain had fought in fear, always bracing for collapse. Standing over the ruins of the Almohad army, that fear vanished. The empire was mortal, unity worked. Muhammad al-Nasir reached Marrakesh a broken man. He shut himself inside his palace, haunted by the snapping chain. Within a year, he was dead, by grief or poison, depending on the source. The man who dreamed of stabling horses in Rome lost his empire in the mountains. But the aftermath wasn't triumphant. The coalition marched on Ubeda. The city surrendered and was sacked anyway. Then disease struck. Dysentery ripped through the camp, killing rich and poor alike. The victorious army dissolved. Peter of Aragon took his loot and left. Sancho returned to the mountains. The crusade ended, not by defeat, but by sickness. The Almohad Empire never recovered. It fractured into rival taifas, easy prey for the next generation of Christian kings. Yet the men who won the battle barely lived to see its fruits. Alonso died in 1214. Peter died in 1213, killed fighting other Crusaders. Sancho lived longest, but withdrew into isolation, crippled and alone. By 1215, the stage was empty, but the map was transformed. The door to the south had been kicked open forever. Las Navas was not just a victory, it was a pivot point, a moment when the future balanced on chains, and they snapped. History isn't just dates, it's people on the edge of extinction. A shepherd, a giant, a king who finally stopped running, and thousands who died in the dust for a future they would never see. The valley is quiet now, but the echo of that collision still shapes our world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the medieval past.